I want to move on to the fourth premise, one of the most important premises in this course. And in many ways we can understand human intellectual history just based on this idea. Should we accept human nature, or can we perfect it, and can it change? This work relies on, or these ideas rely on the work of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, Harvard class of '58, now at Stanford, the Hoover Institute, one of my intellectual heroes. And what he does, and what his work does, is basically explain why people choose to back one political party versus the other, why they choose to live one kind of life versus the other. This single book helped me understand myself better, as well as other people better, whether it's politically, whether it's psychologically, whether it's philosophically. Those of you interested in politics, and there is one book you want to read, after you read Marva Collins, of course, it's this. So what does Thomas Sowell say? Essentially what he does is divide people into two camps. Those who hold the constrained vision, the limited vision, and those who hold the unconstrained, the unlimited vision of human nature. People who hold the constrained vision of human nature believe that human nature cannot be changed. It's immutable. We have certain instincts, we have certain inclinations, they're fixed. This is it. What you see is what you get. What you are born with, what we're born with as a species, is all we have. The flaws that are there are inevitable. They cannot be changed. We need to accept them for what they are. That's the only thing we can do with these flaws. And people who have the constrained vision, who think that our instincts, our inclinations, our basic nature is immutable, accept it. And then what they do, rather than resign, they channel it. How do they channel it? By building certain political institutions that would channel the flawed, imperfect human nature toward the good. Philosophers and psychologists who fall under the constrained vision create then philosophies and psychologies and institutions and systems to channel our flawed and imperfect nature. People who fall under the constrained vision in the history of ideas are people such as Alexander Hamilton, Adam Smith, those of you who are taking or have taken Ec 10, Ayn Rand, Friedrich Hayek. These are people who say our nature is constrained, it's limited. Edmund Burke, another one. What captures this idea best, the words of Francis Bacon, considered the father of the scientific movement, was a philosopher in the 1600s. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed, whether it's physical nature or human nature. We need to obey it. It is what it is. Now we have the unconstrained vision. Bless you, a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more utopian. Human nature can be improved. It can be changed. It's up to us to do so. It is perfectible. We don't need to accept these flaws as inevitable. We can perfect it. There are solutions to these flaws, to these imperfections, and our role, the goal of institutions, whether it's political institutions, educational institutions, of systems, organizations, individuals, philosophers, and psychologists, the role is to change our nature, to perfect it, to better it. Philosophers who held this position, people like Thomas Jefferson, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, George Bernard Shaw, Ronald Dworkin, and other leading thinkers. And what Thomas Sowell did was map the entire intellectual history of the world, showing how people who held this view versus that view led to radically different political prescriptions. The person who best captures the unconstrained view, Benjamin Constant, a French philosopher and politician, it is for self-perfectioning that destiny calls us. Generally, people on the constrained view are people politically, not always, but usually are people who would support capitalism. People like Adam Smith, who talks about the invisible hand. Let's channel imperfect, perhaps flawed human nature toward the good. People who are more on the unconstrained vision would tend toward utopianism or sometimes communism. Not always, but sometimes. Why? Because let's change human nature. Self-interest is not good. It hurts in the long term, and therefore we need to change it. Rather than the constrained vision, people who said, we may not like it, but it is what it is, we cannot change it, let's make the best of it and channel it toward the good. Two radical views, two radical prescriptions based on people's notion perspective. So why am I telling you this? I mean, this is not a political science class, because it has every relevance to psychology as well. It has every relevance to psychology. Do we perceive reality, human nature as constrained or unconstrained will ultimately affect our psychology, and this is very meaningful and important. Let me explain. Now, first of all, some people who have the constrained view when it comes to politics have the unconstrained view when it comes to psychology. It's not always consistent, though it very often is. So the vision of psychology that this course promotes is the constrained view. In other words, my belief, and I'm going to back that up with research today and for the next semester, is that human nature is fixed. We have inclinations, we have certain instincts that are there and have been formed either God-given or evolutionary given for millions of years. They have been formed. They're not going to change anytime soon, not in our lifetime. It's fixed. We're stuck with them for good and ill. And all we can do after we accept this nature is to first understand it through research, and then, after we understand it, make the best use of it. Understand it through research as well as through the search, through introspection. And then make best use of it. How can I channel my nature? And what I want to do now is illustrate a case study of what I mean by nature constraint and why it is so important for happiness, for well-being, for long-term success to have the constrained view of human nature when it comes to our psychology, that is. The topic I want to talk about is the permission to be human. I'm going to talk about this topic for three reasons. A, because it illustrates what Thomas Sowell means politically in the psychological realm. Second, because I think it is one of the most important pillars of well-being and happiness. And the third reason why I'm going to talk about it is because it gets to a misunderstanding that many people have regarding what positive psychology is and is not. When I first started teaching this course and had the 6 students, I remember one day sitting in Leverett House having lunch by myself, and one of the students comes in and says, "Can I join you?" "Sure," we have lunch, and then he says to me, "Tal, I hear you're teaching a class on happiness." And I said to him, "Yes, that's right." And then he said, "You know, my roommates are taking your class." And I said, "That's wonderful." You know, there were 2 of the 6. And then he said, "But Tal, you've got to watch out now." And I said to him, "Why?" And he said, "Tal, you've got to be careful." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because if I see you unhappy, I'll tell them." Now, the next day in class, I used that and I said to the students, you know, the last thing in the world that I want you to think is that I experience a constant high. Or that you, by the end of the semester or the year, it was a year course, you by the end of the year will experience a constant high. There are 2 kinds of people who experience this constant high who don't experience painful emotions, such as anger or envy or disappointment or sadness or unhappiness or depression or anxiety at times. 2 kinds of people who don't experience these painful emotions. The one kind are the psychopaths. By definition, they don't experience these painful emotions. The second kind of people who don't experience these painful emotions are dead people. Exactly. So if you experience these emotions, it's a good sign. You're not a psychopath and you're alive. However, in our culture today, we don't give ourselves the permission to be human, the freedom to experience these painful emotions as well. And we pay a very high price for this inability, for this refusal to accept the fact that it's part of human nature, that is constrained, that is there no matter what. As kids, as babies, going back to the babies theme, we give ourselves the permission to be human. We know that it's natural. We don't even think about it, in fact, to experience high and then low and then high and then low. And later on, when we stop giving ourselves the permission to be human, when the facade becomes so important, when we begin to realize that other people are watching us and evaluating us constantly, and we think they do so much more than they actually do, that's when we stop giving ourselves the permission to be human, and we pay a price in terms of our energy levels, of our well-being, of our happiness, of our creativity, and ultimately also our success. Let me give you an example of someone who does give himself the permission to be human.
אתה בן 7 חודשים, לכל המעוניין. זה ההבדל בין יפה לצחוק. עכשיו תזכה, עכשיו תזכה. תזכה, עכשיו תזכה. עכשיו נצחוק. לא לצחוק, עכשיו תצחוק. רגע, עכשיו תצחוק.
Now, I'm not saying we should look like this. But what I am saying is that we all need a space, a place in our lives where we give ourselves the permission to be human, whether it's with close friends, people we care about, whether it's first and foremost with ourselves when we write a journal, where we do give ourselves the permission to be, to cry, to be joyous, because if we don't, we pay a price. We need a space of unconditional acceptance. The best advice that I got, or that we got, my wife and I, when David, our first son, was born, was from our pediatrician, Dr. Todd Shapiro. And David was born at 1 a.m. in the morning, and then at around 8 a.m. in the morning, he came in to see, to check up on my wife, to check up on the baby. For some reason, he didn't check up on me. And everything was fine, and as he was leaving the room, he turned around and said, just one more thing. Over the next few months, you're going to be experiencing every single kind of emotion to the extreme. And that's fine. It's natural. We all go through it. And then he walked out. It was the best advice that my wife and I got regarding child rearing. Why? Let me give you an example. So, after about a month, I started to, once in a while, experience some envy toward David. Because here he was, for the first time since my wife and I were together, there was someone else who was getting much more attention than I was, no matter how much I cried. And I felt envy toward him. And then 5 minutes later, I experienced this most intense love toward him. Emotions that I haven't felt before. Now, normally I would think, what a hypocrite. It's just, something's wrong. 1 minute you're envious, the next minute you experience love. Well, there is nothing wrong. There is everything right. It's part of being human. And because I had Dr. Shapiro's voice, the back of my mind, permission to be human, that helped me a great deal. Experience the envy when I experienced it, accept it, and then enjoy and celebrate the positive emotions that I experienced toward David. Permission to be human. You see, there is actually a paradox at play, and this is work done by our very own Daniel Wagner on ironic processing. When we suppress a natural phenomenon, that phenomenon only strengthens. And let me illustrate through an experiment. So for the next 10 seconds, bear with me, for the next 10 seconds, do not think of a pink elephant. For the next 10 seconds, do not think of a pink elephant. You know the one I'm talking about? You know, with the big ears, Dumbo? Do not think of a pink elephant for the next 3 seconds, and I'm sure no one thought of a pink elephant, right? Well, what happened? Most people thought of a pink elephant. Because when we try to suppress a natural phenomenon, such as having a visual of a word when we say it, that thing just intensifies. The same applies to painful emotions that are natural, and when we try to suppress them, they strengthen. When I started to teach, after hearing about Marva Collins and deciding that teaching was my calling, I knew that I had to deal with a problem, and the problem is that I'm an introvert. I get very nervous in front of audiences, and large audiences for me is anything above 5. But I had to deal with it, and I knew that I would have to deal with it, so I would go on in front of an audience, and before that I would say to myself, Tao, don't be nervous, don't be anxious, no anxiety today, don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't. And what happened? Pink elephants all around. Instead, after especially reading about Paradoxical Intentions by Viktor Frankl, I started to give myself the permission to be human. And now, when I go into a lecture, the nervousness, because I give myself the permission to be human, goes away within as little as 3 hours into the lecture. But no, it's manageable now. I still get nervous before every single lecture, which is actually a good thing. But it's manageable. I can deal with it. I can handle it. Permission to be human. You see, rejecting our nature leads to suboptimal performance, emotionally as well as in terms of external performance. Imagine waking up every morning and saying to yourself, I refuse to accept the law of gravity. You know, this law of gravity is such a pain. I need to walk down the stairs and then up the stairs. I just want to float to Sanders in the morning. I just want to float to the dining hall after. So much easier, so much less painful. Imagine leading a life like this, where you truly refuse to accept the law of gravity. What kind of life would you lead? Well, first of all, you may not survive for long. If you truly don't accept the fact that things, people being no exception, fall when left in midair. But even if you do survive, let's say you live on the ground floor, even if you do survive, you would lead a life of constant frustration, refusing to accept something that is there whether you like it or not. So instead, we accept the law of gravity. More than that, we create games around the law of gravity. I mean, all those of you who are doing sports here, and it's most of you in this room, who are doing athletics, who go for a run, you rely on the law of gravity. Can you imagine, Harvard versus Yale football without the law of gravity? Can you imagine a basketball game without the law of gravity? And I'm not talking about Michael Jordan, but for the mere mortals. We accept it and we create games around it. And yet we don't do the same. We don't do the same when it comes to our emotions. Now here is the key point. Painful emotions are as much part of human nature as the law of gravity is part of physical nature. And nature to be commanded must be obeyed. An aeronautics engineer who wants to build an airplane has to obey, take into consideration, learn and study and understand the law of gravity. The same applies to a psychologist, the constraint view of human nature. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. And yet we don't do that. We don't do it in our culture, and we pay a high price for it. We have what I call the great deception, where people ask us, so how are you doing? And we say, fine, just great. When in fact, we're not doing so well. More appropriate would be, I'm going through a rough patch now. I'm going through a hard time. I'm really stressed. But yet, we don't want to admit that. We don't give ourselves the permission to be human because we think there is something wrong with us if we experience these emotions. And then when everyone says, oh fine, oh great, oh terrific, then when we are asked, so how are you doing? I'm not going to be the only party pooper here. I'm not going to be the only depressed one around here. So I say, oh fine, oh great, and then we contribute to this great deception. And it is this great deception that leads to the Great Depression. The Great Depression in the ultimate currency of happiness. This to a great extent explains why so many people today experience depression. The 45% figure nationwide on college campuses. Not enough permission to be human. Now I'm not talking about wearing our heart on our sleeves. When someone comes to us in the elevator in William James and says, so how are you doing? Well, thank you for asking. It all started when I was 3. This is not what I'm talking about. This is not what I'm talking about. Well, in William James it may be the case because, the elevators, it does take about 2 hours to get there for the door to close. But other than that, I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about, though, is a space, a safe space in our lives with our closest friends, with our family, first and foremost with ourselves, where we have the permission to be human. And what I'm not talking about is resignation. Far from it. It is not about saying, well, I'm depressed, there's nothing I can do about it, I accept my nature, I accept my state, and that's it. I'm not talking about resignation. What I am talking about is active acceptance. What does that mean? It means understanding that certain things I cannot change and certain things I can and ought to change. One of the main ideas we'll talk about is the distinction, we'll talk about specifically on the lectures on change, between affect, behaviors, and cognitions. The A, B, C of psychology. Affect, emotion, behavior, action, cognition, thoughts. Unconditional acceptance, permission to be human, relates primarily to our affect, to our emotions. They're there, just like human nature, just like the law of gravity is there. That does not mean we need to accept our behavior and our cognition. For example, I can, and have in the past, experienced envy toward my best friend. That, in and of itself, does not make me a bad person. It's human. I've never met a person who has never experienced or who does not experience, well, maybe the Dalai Lama, but other than that, who does not experience envy toward other people. And if it is true about the Dalai Lama, then it's because he has worked on it for decades. Envy is part of human nature. Nothing good or bad about the envy. Nothing good or bad about experiencing anger. Nothing good or bad about experiencing depression or anxiety. It's part of human nature. However, the question is, how do I choose to behave, to act as a result of it? That's where the moral domain enters. That's where I can have moral or immoral behavior toward my best friend or baby or other people in general. I can still experience envy toward my best friend and choose to behave generously and benevolently toward him. The same with cognition, and we'll talk a lot about it when we talk about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I can feel a certain way, but it doesn't mean that I need to resign to my thoughts about that feeling. Rumination is one of the things that we'll talk about a lot. Actually not that helpful to ruminate about painful emotions. It's much more helpful to write about them, to talk to other people about them, rather than to just be thinking constantly about how miserable I am because my girlfriend just left me and I haven't found anyone in Pinocchio's. So rumination doesn't help. So I don't necessarily need to accept all my irrational thoughts. And again, we'll talk about it much more next week, of how we can cognitively reframe what we're thinking. But the emotion, the affect is the emotion. It is what it is. And the key is to be true to reality, which is also one of the main themes in the course. You know, in many ways, this course should not be called positive psychology. Well, I'm telling you this after you already signed up for this class, so it's too late to leave. This is actually not a course in positive psychology. It's a course in reality psychology. Because positive psychology may mean that we're only focusing on the positive, on what works, ignoring all the rest. We're not. All we're doing in this class is shifting the pendulum so that there is more even playing field. Instead of the 21-to-1 ratio, we're doing much more, focusing on the positive. And at the same time, accepting that painful emotions are as much part of human nature as the wonderful emotions. And the sooner we accept it, the better. What that will mean at the end of the course of 1504, or 100 other courses and workshops or books that you read, it's not that you will not have painful emotions anymore. It's simply that your psychological immune system will become stronger. Hopefully already by the end of the semester. Psychological immune system will become stronger, and that means not that we don't get ill. It means that we get ill less often, and that when we do get sick, we recover more promptly. The difference between extremely happy people and extremely unhappy people is not that one gets sad or upset or anxious or depressed and the others does not. Both groups do. It's how quickly, how promptly we can recover from these painful emotions. In other words, how strong our psychological immune system is. And our psychological immune system strengthens when we give ourselves the permission to be human. Many of you have probably read this, come across this, but I think it captures so well the foundation of what it means to be actively accepting. This has become also the official mantra, in many ways, of the AA movement. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom to know the difference. And fortunately, a lot of this wisdom can come from studies, from research, from deep introspection that you will do throughout the semester.